Talking about the new book, The Blueprint, Obama's Plan to Subvert the Constitution and Build an Imperial Presidency. Ken Blackwell and Ken Kuklowski are with us today, and if you would like to join our discussion, we'll open up the phones a little bit later. Ken Blackwell, let me come back to that idea of the Imperial Presidency for just a minute, because one of the themes that sort of runs through your book has to do more with style than substance. And we talk about substance, and certainly this relates. But this president seems to regard any argument that is contrary to his view not just as wrong, but maybe even evil. And people in the past used to say, well, President George W. Bush sometimes was very stubborn in his views, but I'll use the example that Charles Kruthammer used a while back, in which he pointed out that when George W. Bush had his first press conference on stem cell research, he, I think, so fairly represented two different views that it wasn't until his conclusion that a lot of us knew what side he was going to come down on. In other words, he really treated both sides of the argument with fairness. This president seems to basically attribute to anybody who disagrees with them not only bad logic, but bad motives, and that, I think, is part of what is actually running through kind of the book.
Oh, absolutely. Their strategy can be wrapped up in three words. They define, demonize, and destroy. That is their strategy of anybody that gets in the way of their executive and political power grab. Look, they're working to change our republic with its checks and balances, and the way the Constitution is designed, it is designed to minimize the likelihood of the abuse of executive power. The Obama administration wants to backstop his executive power grab with an army of activist federal judges who are bent on determining policy from the bench. And it is that sort of activism that Ms. Kagan represents, and that's why it is so important that we understand what the blueprint is. I mean, he has a historic opportunity with Democrats controlling the Senate, the executive branch, to pack the federal courts, particularly at the appellate court level, where Pelosi and Reid are talking about expanding the number of jurors at that level by 12. He has an opportunity to pack that bench with folks who believe that they make policy, as Sotomayor said, at that level.
Ken Kuklowski, let's talk about constitutional interpretation for just a minute. The section you have there on health care, you talk about the General Welfare Clause, and I think you make such a good case for the fact that that's supposed to limit the federal government's powers, but the people in office right now, the Democratic leadership, this president, basically say that gives them unhindered power to actually legislate. Help us understand that, because that was used constantly as the justification for passing this huge expansion of government control over about 1/7 of the American economy.
Sure. The Supreme Court made clear way back in the 1930s, 1936 in U.S. v. Butler, and 1937 Helvering v. Davis, where the Supreme Court was again at that time confronting an executive that was trying to radically expand federal power. And when issues of the General Welfare Clause came up, they said, no, and they went all the way back to the adoption of the Constitution. And the first serious constitutional scholar who was also a Supreme Court justice, that being Justice Joseph Story, where they showed that for 200 years it was understood that the General Welfare Clause of Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, where it says that the federal government can tax and spend for the general welfare, they go on to explain that that clearly meant not that it gave the government yet another power, but that it was a limitation to say if you are taxing, and only certain types of taxes are constitutional, but in addition to having to be one of those types of taxes, it must also be for the general welfare, meaning the national welfare, as opposed to the welfare of any one state or region. Conversely, that any federal spending must also be for the general welfare, which is why things like the Cornhusker Committee that was removed from the final bill that would have just exempted and subsidized Medicare, Medicaid payments for Nebraska, that would violate the general welfare clause, because the Supreme Court made clear that otherwise general welfare could be a catch-all to allow the federal government to do anything it wants. It would eradicate the idea that there's any limits on the power of the federal government. So they made it absolutely clear that general welfare is a limitation on other federal powers. It grants the government no power by itself.
Again, one of the excellent insights in the book, The Blueprint, by Ken Blackwell and Ken Kuklowski. Let's, if we can, Ken Blackwell, just before we let you go, maybe talk about one other one. We've talked about packing the courts. We talked about the Constitution, constitutional interpretation. But you've worked in the federal government as well as the state government. You say that Barack Obama is using a shadow government of czars. And I've said on this program before, we have more czars in the Obama administration than we had czars in Russia, or the Romanovs. What about that? It seems to me that these are individuals that are obviously unelected. They're actually, in most cases, not going through confirmation process, and yet they are having a disproportionate influence over federal policy.
Right, and in combination with the use of executive regulations as opposed to legislation, the executive branch is trying to use this paragraph as a way of reestablishing an imperial presidency. And so if you begin to see the paragraph by the executive branch, their use of administrative regulations or executive regulations, you begin to understand that they are concentrating power on the or in the executive branch. Let me just give you a practical example. Let's use the present controversy and problem of immigration, and Arizona in particular. You see that state and local government officials have the responsibility for public safety. They don't have responsibility for immigration policy, who can come in and who has to be sent out as a consequence of immigration policy. But they do have the responsibility for public safety. In Arizona, the abductions are the second highest in the world. There's a serious crime problem. Men, women, children are at risk, and the state has decided to take action. State and local government officials. The president is basically saying, poo-poo on that idea. Get out of here, you guys. Or have overstepped your reach. And even though we have proven ourselves to be incompetent to handle the immigration policy, regardless of the impact it has on the public safety policy, we're going to try to override you, whether it's in court or through the use of executive power. So, I mean, we have a real confrontation between the role of the central government and the role of the state and federal officials in our country when public safety is in question. So this is a real issue, but it really does come back to the fact that there's a clash of worldviews, and this president is one who believes in collectivism. He believes in statism, and statists don't believe that rights belong to individuals and are inalienable rights. They believe that they are rationed by the state, conferred on those who the collectivists or the statists or the central government believes deserving of them, and that's a real problem, and it's being played out in everyday life on the ground in our cities and in our states.
Well, Ken Blackwell, I know you need to go, but again, say hi to our good friends there at the Family Research Council, and thank you for such an excellent book.
Well, thank you very much, and let me just say thanks to all of the readers. This was the #1 bestseller in Washington Post, and I just encourage your readers your listeners to read the book because we also lay out an action plan, which I'm sure Ken will talk about.